Sophia had never imagined that her life would take such a tragic turn. At just 13 years old, the weight of her pregnancy, which she hadn't planned for, had driven her family to cast her out into the unforgiving world. The sound of her mother's scorn and her father's furious voice echoed in her mind as she fled into the night, her heart breaking with each step away from the only home she had ever known. The rain had come quickly, as it often did in late spring, the heavy drops soaking through her clothes and chilling her to the bone. Her eyes blurred with tears, mixing with the rain, until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. She stumbled through the streets, the world around her feeling like a distant, suffocating haze. The quiet whispers of neighbors, peering through the windows, haunted her every step. No one seemed to care, no one seemed to see the hurt and fear that pulsed within her. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Sophia, her father's voice thundered earlier that day. His words, harsh and unyielding, stung like 1,000 lashes. Sophia could hardly breathe as she stared at the floor, hands trembling as they clutched the hem of her worn shirt. "Shameless," her mother spat, her tone venomous and sharp. "So young, already pregnant. How could I have given birth to someone like you?" "I didn't mean to," Sophia stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The tears streamed down her face, the weight of her mother's words suffocating her. Her father's voice rose again, louder this time, his fist slamming against the wooden table, making it shake beneath the force. "Do you have any idea how much disgrace you've brought upon this family?" he shouted, his eyes wild with anger. "Do you have any idea what people will say? How can you even show your face here?" Sophia had tried to plead, tried to explain herself, but her mother's cold gaze silenced her. "Why waste your breath on her, Louis? A girl like that doesn't deserve to stay here," Isabella sneered, her lips curling in contempt. Sophia's heart shattered as she lifted her tear-streaked face to her mother, begging, "Please, Mom, please don't make me leave." Her mother didn't even flinch, her gaze as cold as ice. "What are you still kneeling there for?" she sneered. "Get out." Luis, her father, had stood abruptly, pointing toward the door. "Leave, Sophia. This is no longer your home." The words were final, and Sophia's world crumbled beneath her feet. She didn't know where to go, how to survive, but the door swung open, and they turned their backs on her without another word. "I have nowhere to go. I don't know what to do," she whispered into the darkness. Her parents didn't respond. The world outside felt like a strange, hostile place, full of eyes that watched but didn't care. Sophia wandered aimlessly, the rain falling harder now, her feet slipping in the slick mud, the cold creeping into her very bones. She stumbled toward an abandoned house, its windows boarded up, its door hanging off its hinges. But before she could find shelter, a middle-aged man, his face grim and unsympathetic, blocked the doorway. "Get lost," he growled, not sparing her a second glance. "I don't want trouble." Her heart sank. She turned away, not knowing where to go, the heavy rain pouring down on her like a torrential wave. In the distance, a park loomed, and she made her way toward it, the cold benches offering her only the smallest relief. The night deepened, and she curled into herself on a bench, clutching her stomach as if she could protect the tiny life growing inside her. "Please, just let me rest," she whispered through her tears. "Just for tonight." It was then that she heard the footsteps. First, a rustling in the shadows, then the sound of voices, rough, mocking, malicious. 3 figures emerged, their faces hidden by the darkness, their eyes gleaming with malice. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" one of them sneered. "We're looking for some fun, and you're perfect for it." He took a step closer, his grin widening as he sized her up. Sophia couldn't speak, only back away in fear. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen with terror. "Don't run," one of them called. "Where do you think you're going?" Instinct took over. Sophia bolted, her feet slipping on the wet pavement, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she ran blindly into the night. The sound of their footsteps grew louder behind her, but she didn't dare look back. The world seemed to close in on her, each step an attempt to outrun the suffocating fear that gripped her chest. She managed to slip into a narrow alleyway, and by sheer luck she lost them in the darkness. Her body crumpled against the cold brick wall, trembling uncontrollably from fear and exhaustion. "Why? Why does everyone hate me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. That night, the rain did not let up. It was as if the heavens themselves were weeping for her. Sophia curled up under the protection of a large tree in the park, the cold seeping into her very bones. Her fever burned hot, and her body ached in ways she never thought possible. She closed her eyes, her mind drifting in and out of consciousness, when suddenly, a voice broke through the haze. "Child, what are you doing out here?" The voice was warm and kind, but it still felt like a distant echo. Sophia barely had the strength to lift her head. The woman, an elderly figure with a large umbrella, knelt beside her. "Come with me, child," she said, her hands gentle but firm as she helped Sophia to her feet. "You can't stay out here in this storm." I don't have anywhere else to go," Sophia murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Her body gave way, and she collapsed against the woman's warmth. The woman's arms were steady as she lifted Sophia, cradling her as if she were her own. "Don't be afraid. I'll help you." "I'm just an old baker," the woman said, a soft smile on her lips. "But you can stay with me. I'll keep you safe." The woman's name was Margaret, and her bakery was a small, modest place on the corner of the street. The scent of fresh bread and pastries greeted them as they entered, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. The warmth of the room wrapped around Sophia like a blanket, easing the cold that had gripped her for so long. Margaret placed Sophia on a chair by the stove, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. "Sit here," Margaret said, her voice gentle but insistent. "I'll get you some tea." For the first time in days, Sophia felt a glimmer of hope, but as the warmth of the tea spread through her, the pain and sorrow that she had carried for so long still lingered in her heart. She felt a spark of kindness from this stranger, but the hurt from her past still weighed heavily on her soul. Sophia stared blankly at the ground, her hands shaking as she clutched the bread Margaret had given her. It had been days since she'd last eaten anything substantial, and yet, as the crusty loaf touched her lips, the bitterness of her past seemed to overwhelm her senses. She had always been taught to swallow her shame, to hold back tears for fear of burdening others with her misery. But now, as she sat there, with the warmth of the bread against her mouth, the memories flooded her. Her parents' voices echoed in her mind, "You've brought shame upon this family. You don't belong here anymore." Sophia squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sounds, but they pierced through her thoughts like sharp needles. She placed the bread back down on the table, her hunger suddenly unimportant in the face of her emotional turmoil. The weight of her past, of what had happened to her, felt heavier than the hunger gnawing at her stomach. Margaret watched her, her expression soft but full of understanding. Without a word, she sat beside Sophia, placing a comforting hand on her trembling ones. "You don't have to say anything, child. I can see the hurt in your eyes. But know this: you deserve kindness, you deserve to heal. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Sophia wiped her tears away, still feeling unworthy of such compassion. "I'm not. I don't deserve this. I'm the disgrace of my family," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret's voice softened, yet carried an authority that made Sophia look up at her. "No one deserves to be treated that way. You are not a disgrace. You are a human being, and you deserve the chance to live, to move forward, to rebuild your life. I see something in you, something that you might not see yet, but it's there." Sophia met Margaret's gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw something different, not pity, but a quiet, unspoken belief in her. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope that had long since been extinguished inside her. As the days passed, Sophia began helping Margaret in the bakery, though the work was simple: baking bread, cleaning tables, sweeping the floors. Despite the simplicity of the tasks, Sophia found comfort in the routine. It gave her something to focus on other than the relentless whispers and stares that followed her wherever she went. However, despite Margaret's warmth and kindness, the judgment of the townspeople weighed heavily on her. One day, as Sophia was wiping down the tables, a woman in the corner of the bakery looked her up and down with an expression that reeked of disdain. "Who's that girl?" she whispered harshly to Margaret, her eyes narrowing as she eyed Sophia. "She doesn't seem right." "I've heard things about her, Margaret. She's trouble, don't you see it?" Margaret turned sharply, her gaze cold and unwavering. "What I do is none of your business. If you don't like it, you're welcome to find another bakery." Her voice was firm, But the words came from a place of protectiveness, as though she wouldn't allow anyone to hurt Sophia while she was under her roof. But not everyone in the town shared Margaret's sense of compassion. One afternoon, as Sophia was arranging some loaves of bread behind the counter, a man wearing a thick winter coat stepped into the bakery. He had a thick mustache, a sharp, calculating look in his eyes. It was Esteban, the owner of the nearby grocery store, notorious for his miserly ways and a tendency to gossip. "Margaret, we need to talk," Esteban said, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the bakery. His gaze landed on Sophia, and his lips curled into a sneer. "That girl, do you know who she is? I hear she's a disgrace to her family. I wouldn't want to have her in my store, let alone my bakery. It's bad for business." Sophia's heart dropped as she felt the weight of his words sink into her chest like an anchor. She had been trying so hard to move on, to make a life for herself, and yet people like Esteban were determined to drag her down. Margaret stood tall, her posture rigid with defiance. "I don't care about your gossip, Esteban," she said, her voice steady, but with an edge of anger. "This girl has done nothing wrong. If you think you can tell me how to run my bakery, then you can leave." But Esteban was relentless, his voice dripping with venom. "If you keep her here, Margaret, you're asking for trouble. People will stop coming. Who wants to buy bread from a place that's harboring a girl like her? You're ruining your reputation." Sophia tried to hide behind the counter, but she could feel Esteban's cruel words cutting through her like a knife. She wanted to disappear, to hide from the world that seemed so determined to reject her. But Margaret wouldn't let that happen. "Get out," Esteban, Margaret said firmly, pointing toward the door. "And don't come back. You won't have a say in my business. If you have nothing better to do with your life than spread lies, then I suggest you find somewhere else to waste your time." The harsh words from Esteban, and the judgmental whispers that followed, made Sophia feel as though she was suffocating in a world that couldn't accept her. The isolation was crushing, but she tried to push through it for Margaret's sake. The older woman had already done so much for her, and she couldn't bear the thought of causing her any more trouble. Yet the weight of the town's rejection continued to grow. One afternoon, as Sophia was taking out the trash, she was confronted by a group of young men from the neighborhood. They stood in her path, blocking her from returning to the bakery. "Who do you think you are, living here?" one of them, a tall, burly man named Carlos, sneered. "You don't belong here. You've already disgraced this place." Sophia took a step back, her heart racing with fear. "I just want to live peacefully," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Carlos took a step closer, his smirk widening. "Peace? Someone like you wants peace? You've already stained this place with your shame," he said, shoving her hard. Sophia fell to the ground, her body shaking from the impact. She struggled to get up, but the world around her seemed to close in. Margaret's voice rang out from the doorway. "Enough," she shouted, rushing to Sophia's side. She helped her to her feet, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "If you can't show respect, then don't come near my bakery again," she said, her voice as firm as steel. Carlos sneered but didn't challenge her further. "Fine," he muttered, turning on his heel. "But don't blame us when your business fails." Margaret led Sophia back inside, her hands trembling from the encounter. "Don't listen to them, child," she said softly, her voice filled with compassion. "You've done nothing wrong. You don't deserve this." But Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she was a burden, that every day she stayed in the bakery, Margaret was paying a price for her kindness. The rumors, the accusations, they had all piled on top of her, and she didn't know how much more Margaret could take. As the days passed, Margaret's bakery grew quieter, the customers slowly vanishing as the whispers spread. And one evening, as Sophia returned from another fruitless day of looking for work, she found Margaret sitting at the table, a pile of bills in front of her. "Are you okay?" Sophia asked, her voice filled with concern. Margaret sighed heavily, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "I don't know how much longer I can keep the bakery open. People are threatening to stop buying from me, Sophia. If this keeps up, I might have to close the doors." Sophia's heart twisted in her chest. She didn't want Margaret to suffer because of her. "If you want me to leave, I will," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "I don't want to bring you any more trouble." Margaret's gaze softened, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and love. "You foolish girl," she murmured, her hands trembling as she reached out to take Sophia's. "You have nowhere else to go. I won't let you end up on the streets again." But in Sophia's heart, the idea of leaving Margaret, of sparing her from the consequences of her presence, was a thought that gnawed at her day and night. She couldn't let the kind woman suffer because of her. But no matter how much she wanted to leave, she knew deep down that Margaret would never allow it, and perhaps in some way, neither could she. Sophia had barely finished cleaning the last counter in the small bakery when the door swung open again. A gust of cold air swept in, and there, standing in the doorway, was Carlos, flanked by two of his friends. His eyes, dark and full of malice, locked onto Sophia the moment he stepped inside. "Where's Margaret?" Carlos sneered, his voice as sharp as a blade. Sophia froze. Her heart raced, her palms slick with sweat. She's not here," she said, trying her best to sound calm, though her voice trembled. Carlos smirked. "Good. Then we'll just talk to you." One of his friends chuckled low, a sound that sent a shiver down Sophia's spine. The other man didn't even bother to hide his disdain as he looked around the bakery, as though searching for something to destroy. Without warning, Carlos slammed his hand on the counter, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You think you can live here peacefully," he spat. "We already told you this place doesn't welcome you." Sophia's stomach churned with fear, her mind racing. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Carlos, sensing her weakness, took another step closer, his shadow looming over her. "Please." "I don't want any trouble," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a tear slipping down her cheek. Carlos laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "Trouble? You are trouble, Sophia. Ever since you showed up, this neighborhood has been full of rumors, people talking behind our backs. You've caused nothing but problems. Customers stopped coming, people stopped trusting us. All because of you." His words, each one like a dagger, sunk deep into her heart. But before she could respond, the two men behind him began to toss things off the counter, throwing freshly baked bread to the floor with a force that made Sophia's heart sink. Flour and ingredients spilled everywhere, mixing together in a chaotic mess. "Stop," Sophia cried, her hands reaching out helplessly. "Please, don't do this." Carlos, unfazed by her plea, grabbed a loaf of bread and crushed it beneath his boot, his eyes glinting with amusement. "This is your lesson, girl. Get out of here before things get worse." Sophia stood there, frozen, unable to stop the tears that streamed down her face. She felt small, insignificant, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. As Carlos and his friends left, their laughter echoed in her ears, each sound more deafening than the last. She stood alone in the wreckage, her hands trembling as she bent down to pick up the broken pieces of bread scattered across the floor. Each piece seemed to represent something more than just ruined food: her dreams, her hope, her very sense of peace. When Margaret returned, she was horrified by the sight of the bakery. The counters were overturned, the shelves empty, and the air thick with the smell of flour and destruction. "What happened here?" Margaret asked, her voice shaky as she looked around the room. Sophia, feeling her heart break all over again, wiped her tears away and shook her head. I can't stay here anymore, Ba," she whispered. "I'm only bringing you trouble. Every time I try to do something right, it all falls apart." Margaret's face softened, her tired eyes brimming with sympathy. She walked over to Sophia and took her in her arms, holding her tightly as if to shield her from the world. "You're not bringing trouble, child. You're the light of this place. You've given me more joy than you know." But Sophia pulled away slightly, her gaze distant, her hands clutching her stomach. "I don't know how much longer I can take it, B.A. Everywhere I go, people treat me like I'm worthless, like I don't belong. And it's not just me, it's the baby. They can see it. They can see what I am. And they won't let me forget it." Margaret's expression hardened with resolve. "No one has the right to make you feel less than what you are. You carry something beautiful inside you. Don't let anyone, not one person, take that from you."
But the words didn't reach Sophia. The weight of the world felt too much to bear. The cruel stares, the whispers, the constant judgment, it was too heavy for one person to carry alone. She could feel herself breaking piece by piece.
The next day, when Margaret had to leave to meet the landlord about the overdue rent, Sophia stayed behind at the bakery, trying to keep herself busy. But every clink of a spoon against a cup, every shuffle of her feet across the floor, only made her feel more alone. Her thoughts were consumed by the boy, Carlos, and the threats he had left hanging in the air. They haunted her like a shadow, always there, always looming. She wasn't sure how much longer she could live with the fear that he would come back, that he would make good on his promises to destroy everything. As she wiped down a table, lost in thought, the door swung open once more. This time it wasn't Carlos. Instead, it was Isabella, the woman who sold vegetables at the market. Isabella was a troublemaker, known for stirring up gossip and causing chaos wherever she went. Well, Isabella sneered, her lips curling into a mocking smile. "Still here, huh? I thought you'd have disappeared by now." Sophia's stomach twisted in knots, but she tried to keep her composure. "I just need to buy some vegetables," she muttered, avoiding Isabella's gaze. Isabella's laughter echoed in the air, cutting through the stillness like a knife. "You still have the nerve to show your face around here? Do you know what you've done to this place? You've shamed everyone. You've brought nothing but disgrace." Sophia felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar sting of humiliation crawling under her skin. The crowd that had gathered around Isabella's stall began to whisper, their eyes turning toward her like a pack of vultures. "I don't want to cause trouble," Sophia said, her voice shaking. "I just want to live in peace." Isabella scoffed. "Peace? Someone like you wants peace? You're just a girl who couldn't control herself. And now you expect the rest of us to deal with the shame you've brought. How dare you?" The crowd laughed, their voices rising like a tidal wave, and in that moment Sophia couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened and the tears came, unstoppable. She turned and ran, the sound of their laughter echoing in her ears, each step feeling like it was dragging her further into darkness. That evening, when she was cleaning the bakery once more, her heart heavy with despair, the door opened again. This time it was the men Carlos and his friends, their faces twisted with malice. "Where's Margaret?" Carlos growled. "She's not here," Sophia said, trying to stand her ground. But her legs shook beneath her, and she could barely keep her voice steady. Carlos stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with hatred. "Good. Then we'll talk to you." And just like that, the cycle began again. Sophia's footsteps echoed softly on the empty streets as the cold wind bit through her thin coat. She hadn't meant for it to be this way, hadn't wanted to leave, but the burden of staying had grown unbearable. She could still hear Margaret's gentle snore from the corner of the room, a sound so familiar and comforting it almost made her want to stay, but she couldn't, not anymore. She packed her few belongings into a weathered cloth bag. Each item felt heavier than the last, weighed down by memories. The warm, bustling bakery had been her refuge for so long, a small island of safety amidst the storm of her life. But now it was just a reminder of everything she couldn't keep. She looked over at Margaret one last time, her heart aching. The older woman, so selfless, had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go, had shown her love when all she felt was shame. Sophia couldn't bear the thought of Margaret's kindness becoming a burden. Quietly, she wrote a note, as brief as it was painful. "Dear B. Margaret, I am so grateful for everything you've done for me, but I can't stay here and cause you more trouble. I will find somewhere else to live, and I hope people will stop pressuring you. I love you very much. Sophia." May. Her hand lingered on her stomach, where Anna, the little life growing inside her, shifted ever so slightly. "We have to be strong," she whispered, though the words felt hollow in the silence of the room. "Because no one else will help us." She took one last look at Margaret, her heart breaking, and quietly stepped outside. The street was still, and the sky was darkening with the promise of rain. Sophia's breath came in shallow bursts, the chill seeping into her bones. She didn't know where to go, but she walked anyway, her mind fixed on the need to put distance between herself and the bakery, between herself and the life she had tried so hard to escape. She found a boarding house on the outskirts of town, a place where no one would know her, no one would judge her. It was cheap, run down, and filled with an unspoken sense of neglect. The landlord, a gruff middle-aged woman named Dolores, barely glanced at her as she handed over the key. "Room number 3, Dolores said curtly. "Don't bother me if you can't pay up." The room was small and dark, its damp walls a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The bed was too hard, the air too thick, but it was a roof over her head. For the first time in days, Sophia allowed herself to sit down, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her stomach growled, but there was nothing to eat. Her eyes welled with tears, but she held them back, determined not to break down. "Not yet. We'll be okay," she whispered, but she didn't believe it. Not at all. The next day, Sophia ventured out to find work. There was no other choice, but each place she approached turned her away with cold indifference. "No vacancies," they would say, or "You're too young," or worse, "We don't want trouble." The words, the judgment, felt like a physical blow, each one sinking deeper into her heart. Her growing belly made her an easy target for cruelty, a visible mark of her failure. When she returned to the boarding house, a group of children had gathered near her door. They stared at her with mocking eyes, their laughter ringing in the air like daggers. "Look at her belly," one boy shouted. "It's like a big balloon." The others howled with laughter. "She must be a bad person. Her family kicked her out," another added, a smirk playing on his lips. Sophia's face burned with shame. "Stop it," she tried to say, but her words only fueled their laughter. She wanted to hide, to disappear, but all she could do was stand there, humiliated, as they tormented her. That night she lay in her dark room, clutching her stomach. The laughter echoed in her ears, a cruel reminder that the world saw her as nothing more than a mistake. She tried to comfort Anna, but the words wouldn't come. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I couldn't protect you." The next morning she hoped for some peace, but when she opened her door, Dolores was waiting for her, her face hard and unforgiving. "You stole from me, didn't you?" Dolores's voice was sharp and accusing. Sophia's heart sank. "No, I didn't take anything. I swear," she stammered, her mind racing. "Then why is the money missing?" Dolores crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "I don't know. I didn't take it," Sophia protested, but her voice cracked. "Please, I didn't." But Dolores wasn't listening. "You have 24 hours to pay up or get out. I won't keep a thief in my house." The other tenants had gathered by now, whispering amongst themselves. Sophia felt the weight of their eyes on her, the judgment that only seemed to grow with each passing day. When she returned to her room, she found it ransacked. Her meager belongings lay scattered across the floor. Her small pouch of money was gone. No, this couldn't be happening. Panic set in as she rushed to find Dolores, hoping to explain, but before she could speak, Dolores cut her off. "It's you again. Don't try to blame anyone else. You did this to yourself." Dolores spat, her voice harsh. Sophia's heart shattered. She was alone, completely alone. That night, she could do nothing but cry, the weight of her hopelessness pressing down on her. She clutched her stomach, whispering to Anna, "I'm so sorry. Where will we go now?" The following morning, she packed her things and left the boarding house without a word. Dolores didn't even look up as she handed over the key, her indifference cutting deeper than any insult. Sophia wandered through the streets, her body aching from hunger and exhaustion. The cold wind stung her skin, and her legs felt like lead. She reached the corner of the market, where she had once been given leftover bread by kind strangers, but today, no one noticed her. Her voice was hoarse from the cold, as she asked a woman behind a stall, "Do you have any leftover food?" The woman looked at her with disdain. "Go somewhere else." Sophia's heart broke, but she bowed her head, thanked the woman, and walked away. She found a bench in a small park and sat, her hands cradling her belly. "What did I do wrong, Anna? Why is the world so cruel?" Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she wiped them away. Suddenly, a group of children passed by, their laughter piercing the quiet. One of the boys stopped and pointed at her belly. "Look, she's so fat," he shouted, and the others burst into laughter. Sophia lowered her head, unable to stop the tears from flowing. She wished she could disappear, but the world wouldn't let her. As night fell, she found a dark corner behind abandoned buildings and curled up, trying to shield herself from the cold. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but sleep wouldn't come. The cold, the hunger, the isolation, it all felt endless. But then, she heard footsteps. At first, she thought it was just another passerby, but the footsteps stopped in front of her. She looked up, and her heart skipped a beat. It was Margaret, her face worn and tired, holding a flashlight and an old umbrella.
"Bar Margaret," Sophia gasped, her voice breaking.
Margaret knelt before her, her hands trembling as she touched Sophia's face. "You foolish child, you scared me half to death. I've been searching everywhere for you." Sophia's sobs were unstoppable now, the flood of relief and exhaustion overwhelming her. "I didn't want to make you suffer anymore." Margaret pulled her into a tight embrace, her frail arms surrounding Sophia like a shield. "Don't you understand? You are my family. I would never leave you, no matter what happens." And for the first time in days, Sophia felt a warmth she thought she had lost forever. Sophia sat behind the counter of her small cafe, the steady hum of the morning bustle enveloping her in a comforting rhythm. The warm aroma of freshly baked pastries filled the air, a scent that had come to symbolize her new life, one that she had fought for, one that had grown from the ashes of her past. Her daughter, Anna, was behind the pastry counter, a bright smile lighting up her face as she neatly arranged the day's treats. The cafe, now named after Anna, was a quiet haven on the outskirts of Miami, a far cry from the chaos and sorrow that had once defined Sophia's life. She wiped the counter, her mind drifting back to the days when she first arrived at the bakery with Margaret. Those days had been full of uncertainty, but Margaret's unwavering support had given her something she thought she had lost forever: a sense of home. A tear threatened to escape, but she quickly brushed it away, focusing on the here and now. "Thank you, Margaret," she whispered to herself, though the woman was no longer there. Margaret had passed away quietly, leaving Sophia with a legacy of love, strength, and resilience. As the bell over the cafe door jingled, a familiar voice broke through Sophia's reverie. It was Julia, an old friend of Margaret's, carrying a small bundle of photographs. Julia, ever the storyteller, had a way of bringing the past to life. She was in her 60s now, but her energy still radiated like the sun, always eager to share stories and memories. "Sophia," she called with a smile, "I found these while cleaning my attic. You have to see these photos of Margaret." Sophia glanced up and smiled softly. It was always comforting to hear stories about Margaret, to remember how the woman had shaped her world. As Julia laid the photos on the counter, Sophia bent down to look. She smiled at the sight of Margaret in her youth, full of laughter, strength, and life. "She was the most incredible person I've ever known," Sophia said quietly, tracing the outline of Margaret's face in one of the pictures. "If it weren't for her, Anna and I wouldn't be here today." Anna, curious as always, scampered over from the pastry counter and peered over her mother's shoulder. "Is this Margaret, Mom? I've never seen photos of her when she was young." Sophia nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "Yes, darling, Margaret did so much for me and for you too. She was our family when we had none." The sound of the doorbell interrupted their quiet moment, and as the door creaked open, a chill swept through the cafe. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. A frail woman stood in the doorway, her silver hair and worn features unmistakable. Despite the years, Sophia recognized her instantly: Isabella, her mother. Sophia's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening as the past she had buried so deep came rushing back. "Isabella," she whispered, her voice shaking, "what are you doing here?" The woman hesitated, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Sophia, it's me, your mother." The room seemed to close in on her. Julia, sensing the weight of the moment, took a step back, allowing the two women to confront each other in silence. Anna looked between them, confusion written on her young face. "Mom? Who is she?" Sophia stood frozen, her hands trembling. "What are you doing here after all these years?" After everything, her voice was sharp, filled with years of repressed pain. "You think you can just walk in like nothing happened? After you threw me out on the streets with nothing but your pride? After you chose the family's honor over your own daughter?" Isabella's eyes filled with regret as she lowered her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I know I have no right, but I couldn't live with the guilt anymore. I came to apologize. I made a terrible mistake."
Sophia's laugh was bitter, the sound of it jagged and painful. "Apologize? You think a few words can fix everything?" Tears welled up in her eyes, her chest tight with the weight of her emotions. You abandoned me when I needed you the most. And now you think you can just come back and erase all the years of pain.
Anna's small voice cut through the tension. Mom, who is she? Why did she leave you?
Sophia turned to her daughter, her expression softening. She knelt down to Anna's level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I'll explain everything, sweetheart. Just not right now, she stood, her gaze locking with Isabella's, the years of hurt still raw and fresh.
Isabella reached out, her hands trembling as she took Sophia's in hers. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, she said, her voice thick with emotion, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. Sophia shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. It's not that simple, Isabella. 13 years. 13 years of silence, of building myself from nothing. You weren't there. Now, after all this time, I don't know if anything you say will change that. Julia, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Sophia, sometimes forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about you. It's about freeing yourself from the chains of anger and pain. Sophia turned to look at Julia, her gaze conflicted. The anger, the pain, and a deep-seated vulnerability she didn't want to face churned within her. Anna looked at her mother, then at Isabella, her expression one of confusion. Mom, what's going on? Who is this woman? Sophia squeezed her daughter's hand, fighting the surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. This is your grandmother, Anna. Anna's eyes widened, and she turned to Isabella. Is that true? You're my mom's mother? Isabella nodded, her face etched with sorrow. Yes, my dear, I made terrible mistakes. I abandoned your mother when she needed me most, but I can't live with this regret any longer. I have to try to make things right. Sophia watched the exchange, her heart torn between the woman who had given her life and the woman who had been her mother. The bitterness in her heart was strong, but so was the lingering ache of longing for something she couldn't name. Anna's small voice spoke again, firm yet gentle. If you truly regret it, you have to show it. Not with words, but with actions. Isabella knelt before Anna, her voice trembling. You're right. I will do whatever it takes to make amends. Just then, a look of realization flashed across Isabella's face. Sophia, your father, he died shortly after you left. He was never the same. He regretted what happened between us, but his pride kept him silent. He never stopped loving you. Sophia's breath caught. Father is dead, her voice cracked as a rush of grief and unresolved questions flooded over her. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why now? Isabella's grip tightened on Sophia's hands, her eyes brimming with tears. I didn't know how to reach out. I was afraid you would never forgive me. But after your father passed, I realized I couldn't bear to lose you too. Sophia stood motionless, her heart a tumult of emotions as the elderly woman, frail and trembling, stood before her. The words her mother had just spoken hung in the air like a heavy cloud, casting a shadow over the quiet cafe. Your father is dead, Isabella had said, her voice breaking with the weight of a truth long buried. And now, standing there in front of her, the very person who had cast her aside all those years ago, was asking for forgiveness. Sophia Margaret's voice, though soft, was laced with concern. The older woman stood at the counter, her hands still, the once cheerful bustle of the cafe suddenly stilled by the tense presence of Sophia's estranged mother. Margaret's eyes darted from Sophia to Isabella, sensing the unbearable heaviness of the moment. Sophia didn't know how to respond. She felt as though the room had grown too small for the weight of the past that had come crashing into her present. Her thoughts whirled, pulling her in opposite directions toward anger, toward disbelief, toward something that resembled the faintest flicker of hope. But nothing could push through the coldness that had settled in her heart all these years. Why now, she finally managed to ask, her voice hoarse with emotion. After 13 years of silence, you walk in here, like nothing happened. Like you didn't abandon me, like you didn't throw me away. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she took a step closer, though she hesitated, afraid of pushing her daughter too far. I know, she whispered, her voice ragged. I've been living with this, with the guilt. It's been eating away at me. I didn't come here to make excuses, only to ask for forgiveness, and to tell you your father. He was never the same after you left. He was lost, Sophia. I couldn't face him, couldn't face you, but the guilt. Her voice cracked. Sophia looked at her mother, and for a moment she saw something in those weary eyes, a rawness that mirrored her own pain. But it didn't erase the years of suffering, the nights spent alone, the endless cycle of trying to survive. How could she forgive that? How could she forgive a mother who had failed her so completely? "I built a life without you," Sophia said quietly, her voice filled with a pain so deep it felt as if it might break her in two. "A life with Margaret, with Anna. I don't know if I can just let go of all that. 13 years. It's not just some number, it's a lifetime." Anna, who had been standing quietly, looking back and forth between the two women, finally spoke up. "Mom," she said, her voice small but strong, "who is she? Is she really my grandmother?" Her eyes, wide with confusion, flicked to Sophia and then back to the woman in front of her. Sophia paused, torn between the desire to protect Anna from the storm swirling inside her and the need to be honest. "Yes, Anna," she said slowly, her voice softer than before. "She is your grandmother." The words felt heavy, like they didn't quite belong. There was a world of pain behind them, a world Anna could never fully understand yet. "But you're right to ask." Sophia continued, kneeling down to her daughter's level, her heart swelling with the love she felt for this child, this light in her life. "Sometimes, it's not enough to just say sorry. Sometimes, you have to show it, to prove it." Anna, for her part, seemed unsure of how to react. Her small hands reached out to grasp her mother's, her gaze turning back to Isabella. "Are you really sorry?" she asked, her voice filled with the innocent directness of a child who had seen only love in her mother's eyes. Isabella looked at Anna, the weight of her regret pressing heavily on her chest. She sank to her knees in front of the child, her hands shaking as she took Anna's tiny hands in hers. "I am so sorry, my dear. I was a terrible mother, and I abandoned your mother when she needed me most. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know, from the bottom of my heart, that I regret it, and I'll do whatever I can to make it right." For a moment, there was silence. The air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, an answer, a resolution, some sign of forgiveness. Margaret, who had remained in the background, her presence quiet but steady, finally spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Sophia, you don't have to forgive her right now. Forgiveness is a long road, but sometimes healing begins with just acknowledging the hurt, and that's what she's doing, whether you can accept it or not." Sophia felt her heart tighten. Was Margaret right? Could forgiveness begin with something as small, yet as monumental, as simply accepting an apology? Could she find peace in letting go of the bitterness that had consumed her for so long? Her eyes flicked back to Isabella, who was still kneeling before Anna, her tears now flowing freely. It was strange to see her mother like this, vulnerable, broken, pleading. But wasn't it what Sophia had always wanted? Her mother's love, her mother's attention? In her heart, a small voice whispered, "Maybe it's time to stop holding on to the past. Maybe it's time to let go." But Sophia wasn't sure. There were so many scars, so many unanswered questions. Why hadn't her mother tried harder back then? Why hadn't she fought for her when the world seemed to turn against them? Sophia, Margaret's voice broke through her thoughts again, warm and steady. "You don't have to decide anything today. Not now. Just take it one step at a time." Sophia nodded slowly, her hand finding Anna's, holding it tight as if she needed that anchor to stay grounded. She looked at Isabella, her expression softening just a little. "You've been absent for too long," she said quietly. "I don't know what will happen next, but if you really want to make things right, then prove it. Show me you can be the mother I needed back then. And maybe we can start from there." Isabella nodded, her hands trembling but her resolve clear. "I will. I promise." As the two women, one broken by regret, the other scarred by loss, stood in the silence of the small cafe, Anna's wide eyes flickered between them. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: healing, though slow, had begun. And in the warmth of the small cafe, life, with all its complexities, would move forward one step at a time,